So the last thing that this gardener says, so this is a really cool video about weeds and what makes a weed a weed. And her kind of thesis is that it's a weed if you say it is. That the definition of a weed is something you don't want in your garden, whatever that might be. And she pushes us to kind of expand our understanding of what that might be. And she ends with this phrase: what if weeds are not just a nuisance, but a sign of an ecosystem at work? So, you'll have to imagine that you are profoundly impacted by that expert saying that, talking about how important weeds are to the ecosystem. And I acknowledge that that statement may be controversial. It may be one of the most controversial things that I've ever said from this pulpit. As a matter of fact, for those of you who are gardeners or farmers or have lived on a farm, to hear me say that weeds are actually an important part of a biodiversity within an ecosystem, you might want to send me an email after this sermon. Just remember, my email address is rachel.ward@maplewoodumc.org. I will say to gardeners and farmers alike, you are in charge of your own garden, and you can make a weed be whatever you want to in your own garden. I'm asking you to suspend that, applying that to universally across the board, because there are wonderful weeds that can do wonderful things for our world. For example, that pesky nuisance, the dandelion, which appears in so many of our yards, is actually quite tasty. The greens of dandelions can be made into a salad. Also, dandelion flowers, the yellow part before they go to seed, appear very early in spring, which means they are early food for bees, and we all love bees. In addition, the taproot, which is long and goes way down, which is why it's so hard for you to pull it out, works to loosen up the soil, which is good for other plants as well. Or that ubiquitous weed, the white clover, which appears across so many of our yards. White clover fixes nitrogen, which means white clover is really good at taking nitrogen out of the air and putting it into the soil so that other plants are healthier. What is the primary ingredient of lawn fertilizer? Nitrogen. So we work really hard to get all the white clovers out of our yard so that our yard is pristine and green. Then we have to put nitrogen onto it to keep it that way. See where we're going with this. The other thing that white clover can do is, it turns out bunnies love white clover. So if you've got some other things that you don't want the bunnies to eat, white clover will be like, oh, here's a nice little treat for me over here, and pull them away from the treat. Also, this week, I learned that there is such a thing as white clover pudding. I don't know if anybody has an old family recipe for white clover pudding, but I'm going to need someone to make some of that so we can have it at our next potluck. The third weed that I want to highlight is our beloved friend chickweed. And chickweed is medicinal. So you can make a tea out of the leaves of chickweed, and if you have a persistent cough, thank you, Beth, for that example. If you have a persistent cough, the tea of chickweed is an expectorant, and it can help you get rid of your cough. It also, apparently, if you have an inflammation on your skin, the leaves of chickweed can be wiped onto your skin to remove the inflammation. And this list goes on and on and on. These plants that we think of as weeds and nuisances, they are so good for us and for the plants around them and for the world in general. Another thing to highlight is that weeds are good, but if one particular species of weed takes over the whole garden, that's also not good. It's not about one plant being everywhere, it's about ecodiversity. It's about the biological diversity of the world around us helping one another, encouraging one another, and building off of one another. So we don't want just one weed. So don't hear me saying just let the white clover go crazy. You got to have a little white clover and a little chickweed and some dandelions. Then you're doing it right. So today we heard this parable about weeds. It's called the weeds and the wheat. Steve read it for us. This is one of those kingdom of heaven parables. And I first want to unpack the phrase kingdom of heaven just a little bit. The Greek word is basileia to uranu, and the Greek word basileia is the word that we usually end up saying as kingdom. Interestingly enough, basileia is a feminine noun in the Greek. English translators have misgendered the word basileia when they translate it as kingdom, because kingdom is gender specific, masculine, and basileia, with the a at the end, is a feminine noun. Basileia, as it turns out, is also the same word that's used in the scripture to refer to Rome, the Roman Empire. So perhaps a preferable term is just empire, the empire of heaven. The message is quite clear. This is an alternative to Rome. You've got the empire of Rome and you've got the empire of heaven. Those are the same word describing those two different things. It is an obvious comparison contrast. Divine priorities and the priorities of the state are different and always have been, even going back to Jesus' day. Also, that's basileia. Basileia to uranon. So that word is actually plural. So when we say kingdom of heaven, as if it's a singular one place, it's actually not as accurate as saying the heavens or even the skies. So kingdom of heaven can just as easily be the empire of the skies, which I find to be a very beautiful phrase. And I think it describes a fuller picture of what Jesus is telling us about here, the empire of the skies. It's everything that exists. It is the known universe, and it stands in direct contrast to the empire of the world, the empire of Rome. Today's reading is one from a series in Matthew 13 about this empire of the skies. We're going to hear about more of those parables next Sunday when the Reverend Brenda Stobie is here preaching. She will pick up a couple other of those images from Matthew 13 about this vision that Jesus wants us to know about. This parable, the weeds and the wheat, it emphasizes so many things. It's such a beautiful, beautiful teaching parable. And the thing about parables is when preachers try to explain them, they are losing the point of the parable in the first place, which is not to be explained, but to let us wonder about what we might discover here. So this is in the spirit of opening up space so we can wonder about what we might discover here. One thing that I'm struck by immediately is the patience of the farmer. The farmer who knows that things happen in seasons. And so when the slaves come to say, should we get rid of the wheat, the farmer is able to say, it is not the season for getting rid of weeds right now. It is not the season. We just need to be patient. And so just on the surface, I've discovered something about patience and seasons and letting things happen in due course. The only way to judge between the wheat and the weeds here is to wait until the harvest season. And in the meantime, in this season, we are to be patient. We are to be patient with one another. We are to be patient like the farmer is. Let them grow together. The things happen in seasons. I read a commentary by Dr. Warren Carter about this passage. He was my New Testament professor at St. Paul. He's now at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. And Dr. Carter points out some things that are really unusual about this parable that we might not realize are unusual unless we know some things about the context in which the story is told. The first thing we should see right off the bat is that this is a farmer who has slaves, and yet it is the farmer sowing the seed. The farmer, the landowner, the boss is sowing the seed, not the slaves. That would have been unusual. And the hearers of the story would have wondered, why didn't you have your slaves sow the seed since you're the landowner? The second thing that's really unusual here is that the landowner, the farmer knows why there are weeds in the field. You catch that? We are told, because we're reading the story, the narrator tells us, an enemy snuck in and sowed the bad seeds in there. But when the slaves go to the landowner already knows that. They say, look at these weeds out here, and the landowner says, yeah, an enemy snuck in and sowed some bad seeds. How in the world does the farmer know that that happened? Because we're also told that it happened while everyone was asleep. Weeds growing in this field. And why in the world would the landowner have said, it's because an enemy snuck in and sowed bad seeds? These are weeds growing on a farm. Like, shouldn't we expect weeds to grow on a farm? The script should have been, hey, landowner, hey, farmer, the farmhands come in, there's weeds growing in the field. And the farmer's response would have been, duh. It's a farm. There's going to be weeds. So this is surprising, a surprising detail. The third thing, the farmhands ask if they should weed the field. And the farmer says, no, don't tend the field. This is the crux of the whole parable. This is the point that most people realize and hold up as the main surprising thing in the parable. The farmer's response is, don't weed that field. Because weeding the field would be expected. Those of you who are gardeners and farmers, you are shocked and astonished that a farmer said, no, don't weed the field. Don't get rid of the weeds. Let them grow together. And then he says, the only way you'll be able to discern between wheat and weeds is to wait until harvest time. Wait until harvest time. By the way, the other thing to know about this parable is that it is not talking about just a random assortment of weeds. Our English translation here is insufficient. Weeds does not accurately capture what is really being talked about. The Greek term in question is zizania, and zizania refers to a specific kind of plant. The specific kind of plant in question is known in English as darnel. And the reason you haven't heard of darnel is because it has been effectively eliminated from modern agriculture. Modern agriculture has gotten rid of this plant altogether because, as it turns out, darnel is also known as false wheat. In fact, an article I read about it referred to it as wheat's evil twin. Darnel is a weed of cultivation. Darnel does not grow in the wild. The only way that darnel sprouts is if its seeds get mixed into real wheat seeds. And when those seeds are sown, the darnel is already mixed in with the wheat. That is the only way that darnel survives. Already mixed in with the wheat. And when darnel sprouts and wheat sprouts, you can't tell the difference. They look exactly the same. And as they grow, they look exactly the same. And they continue to look exactly the same until they bear fruit. The ear of grain of darnel looks different than the ear of grain on wheat. You can tell the difference when it produces fruit. You have to wait until harvest time to be able to tell the difference between the two, because literally until that time, you cannot tell the difference. So why did we have to get rid of darnel in modern agriculture, I hear you ask? Well, it turns out that darnel grains have an intoxicating effect. So back in the day, people would grind up darnel and make bread out of it. A certain kind of bread. A really, really groovy kind of bread. Okay. Or they would sprinkle it into their beer to add impact to their beer. It was used as an anesthetic. In ancient Greece, followers of Persephone and Demeter used darnel in their ritual practices. In Shakespeare, darnel appears multiple times, including woven into the crown of King Lear as he goes crazy. Darnel and wheat, so similar that you can't tell the difference until it produces fruit. By the way, too much darnel is fatal. So while they are growing, you can't tell the difference. But when they bear fruit, you can. You will know them by their fruits. When Jesus said, "You will know them by their fruits," he was warning about, quote, false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You can't tell from the outside appearance. You can tell by the fruit, by the actions, by the words, by how lives are lived. In other words, from the outside, you can't tell sheep from sheep. You can't tell wolf in sheep's clothing from legitimate sheep. The only way to judge between wheat and weeds is to wait until the harvest, until the fruit is produced, and then you will be able to tell. Now, I got to say, this is an incredibly dangerous parable. This is a risky parable because it doesn't take too much for us to try to start figuring out who the weeds are among us. Right? We know we're not supposed to get rid of them, but at least we should identify them. Isn't it interesting, whenever we're thinking about this binary, this dichotomy, we are always the wheat. Whoever the we is, and they are always weeds. Whoever the they are. Whether the they is whatever demographic group that we tend to other, right? That I tend to other. They're the weeds. I know I'm wheat, so I'm okay. And this parable, it says, don't pull the weeds out because, you might pull a weed out instead. And we get this little feeling of self-satisfaction because, I'm wheat, so I'm going to be okay. And all the theys, all the weeds around me, they're going to get theirs at the end of time. And that's a pretty common interpretation of this parable, as a matter of fact. But that is dangerous. Because that little feeling of satisfaction, self-satisfaction, that little feeling that I'm wheat and someone else is weeds, that's an evil feeling. And I would go so far as to say that feeling is the darnel. That feeling is the bad seed that has been sown among us. That's the true weed here. The feeling that the enemy has sown among us. Because we know, we know that life does not occur in binaries. We know that life is more complicated than good, bad, than wheat, weed. Dr. Carter says, this parable's presentation of two antithetical types of plants presents a view of human beings that hardly reflects the complexity of human life. Life is not a dichotomy. We live on a series of spectrums, whether those spectrums be gender or sexual orientation or economic stability or physical ability or mental health. Everything about our lives happens on a continuum. It makes us very complex beings who live in a very complex community. It's never as simple as weeds and wheat. We know this because we have felt it within ourselves. We know this, especially those who are brave enough to be honest with themselves know this to be true. Sometimes your wheat. Sometimes life gets pretty weedy. But remember, weeds are not a nuisance. Weeds are a sign of an ecosystem at work. It's when you know an ecosystem is healthy, when there is biodiversity within it. See, the problem isn't a presence of what we consider to be a weed. The problem is when one plant, be it weed or wheat, takes over the entire garden. Let them grow together. Let them grow together. And then consider the fruit that they bear. You'll know. You will know. You will know good fruit from bad. And if you don't know, there's a helpful list in Galatians chapter 5 that tells us love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This is what the good fruit is supposed to look like. And we can expect there to be darnel mixed in as well. That's the only way darnel survives, remember, is to be mixed in with the wheat. The only way evil exists is mixed in with the goodness. In fact, maybe, just maybe, it is the existence of evil itself that helps us recognize the goodness in the world. Or you could say it another way. You know something's a flower when you have a weed to compare it to. One of my favorite Broadway musicals comes from a book called Secret Garden. How many read the book Secret Garden at some point or saw the musical perhaps? It's about a garden. It's about actually this young girl named Mary Lennox. And Mary is orphaned and goes to live with her uncle Archibald. Archibald has a life that contains a lot of what we would consider to be weeds. He has a pretty weedy life. He is grieving the death of his wife. He is cold and distant. He is very, very wealthy, but he's very, very unhappy. And he wants nothing at all to do with Mary when she comes to his house. And when they finally have an opportunity to sit down and talk together, he asks her, how are they treating you? Are they treating you okay? And she says yes. And he says, well, is there anything that you lack? Is there anything that you would like? And she asks for a bit of earth. She just wants a bit of earth in which she can plant some seeds. And her request causes Uncle Archibald to wonder. A bit of earth. She wants a little bit of earth. She'll plant some seeds. The seeds will grow. The flowers bloom, but is their bounty what she needs? How can she chance to love a little bit of earth? Does she not know? The earth is old and doesn't care if one small girl wants things to grow. She needs a friend. She needs a father, brother, sister, mother's arms. She needs to laugh. She needs to dance and learn to work her girlish charms. She needs a home. The only thing she really needs I cannot give. Instead she asks a bit of earth to make it live. She should have a pony, gallop across the moor. She should have a doll's house with 100 rooms per floor. Oh, why can't she ask for a treasure? something that money can buy that won't die. When I give her the world, she asks instead for some earth, a bit of earth. She wants a little bit of earth. She'll plant some seeds. The seeds will grow. The flowers bloom, their beauty just the thing she needs. She'll grow to love the tender roses, lilies fair, the iris tall. And then in fall, her bit of earth will freeze and kill them all. A bit of earth, a bit of earth, bit of earth, a bit of earth. So what if the parts of our lives that we considered to be weeds were actually not nuisances in our hearts and our minds, but actually could become for us a sign of a healthy and flourishing ecosystem? An ecosystem of life where everything happens in its season. Spring planting, summer flourishing, autumn harvest, winter dormancy, and spring planting once again. The empire of the skies is like this farmer who doesn't let the slaves sow the seed, but goes to do it on their own, and does so with the full knowledge that the weeds are there. And when those slaves eventually discover the weeds that they should have expected to be there all along, they are oh so eager to remove them from the field. But when they ask permission to do so, expecting to get that permission, the farmer says no. Be patient. Let them grow together. Wheat and weeds. We'll have to wait for the harvest to be able to tell them apart. We shall know them by their fruit. May the words of my mouth, may the meditations of all of our hearts be truly acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.